Hello, hello. Today we have the matchup graphs for week number 6, receiver, then quarterback, and then running back. We have the adjusted matchup rank on the bottom. Number 1 on the left side being not that good. It's a really good defense for your fantasy guy. And then number 32 all the way on the right means they have the best matchup in the business right now. And then the volume rank on the left. How good is that projected volume for this week? Obviously, you want to be up top. This green section right here just means they have a great matchup and really good projected volume on the week. In the red, the opposite compared to what they're usually getting, at least for most players. So let's start with receivers, and let's start with the shadow corners. There's 5 guys that are highlighted in red that will have one of those top corners on the team shadowing them play to play. That will be Marvin Harrison Jr. right here above Pittman, Drake London, Quinton Johnston, Garrett Wilson, and Courtland Sutton. So starting with Marv, he's got Charvarius Ward. It's a slight downgrade. It's not too big of a deal. Ward is only being targeted 18% of the time right now, though. A lot of that will come down to who plays, Kyler Murray or Jacoby Brissett. And does that mean it's a good or a bad thing for Marv? Because I'm not sure Brissett being in there is necessarily a bad thing. I like him overall in a matchup that the Colts have forced a ton of passing work this week or for this season. Nobody's being passed on more than the Colts this year. So it could set up well for Marv, especially Brissett. You have a better chance of having higher volume at least. Drake London is going to be shadowed by Christian Benford. Benford was amazing last season. This year, it has not been the case so far. His numbers are pretty bad. So I'm not too scared in terms of Drake London, as well as he's going to be able to get away from him a little bit in the slot. After they fired that wide receiver coach last week, London's slot rate went up to about 42%. Usually those shadow corners will not follow guys into the slot as often. So maybe gets away from him a little bit compared to being that sole outside receiver like some of these guys, like a Quinton Johnston. Not sole outside, but 80% of the time for Quinton Johnston. He will have Rasul Douglas. Not too many changes, honestly, here. Rasul Douglas, the most targeted corner in that secondary right now. Miami's coverage scheme does favor Keenan Allen, I will say. Lots of what they do, they run more cover 2 than anybody in the NFL, and Allen has dominated against that this year. So I would say it favors Keenan Allen a little bit more in this matchup. Garrett Wilson has the Patrick Surtain shadow. It's not good for anybody. It's really just going to come down to how much can he get in garbage time, which is kind of what it's come down to every single week. This is just more an extreme version of that. And then Courtland Sutton, all the way here on the left, Sauce Gardner, an extremely similar spot that we saw last week with George Pickens, who, yes, did all right at the end of the day because he had that 40-yard touchdown, but that's really all he had. He only had 2 receptions, 4 targets. So it could be a similar day for Sutton, who's a similar receiver, banks on those touchdowns sometimes. His volume is a lot better than Pickens week to week, at least usually when Lamb is in there. So maybe that volume is a little bit better than 4 targets, but a lot of this week is going to come down. Can Denver or Courtland Sutton get into the end zone, especially with a potential game script against an 0-5 Jets team? Makes him a little bit riskier, I will say. Now we'll go to the top right, the Rams receivers. Obviously, you're going to start him, but it could be another huge week, especially for Adams. I'll get to him in a second. I'll start with Nacua because he's all the way over on the right because he's more of that slot guy. This year, he's playing a lot in the slot, even compared to the last couple of years. No Cooper Kupp, part of that, and you add in Devontae Adams. So Puka, 2 things. 1, that slot matchup. He has had the number 1 slot matchup prior in a game before. He had 15 targets, 13 receptions, 170 yards, and a touchdown versus the Colts. Wouldn't be shocked at all if he did something similar against Baltimore this week. And they also play 41% man coverage 41% of the time. That's not a recipe for success, especially when you're not good at it, like Baltimore is. Nacua is averaging over 1 fantasy point per route against man coverage this year. That is just ridiculous. Every single time they man up on Nacua, he's getting a point per route. So not very smart for that Ravens defense, who has been struggling heavily. And then Adams, I talked about it earlier this week, getting a ton of that valuable work in the red zone, those downfield targets. Baltimore is dead last in either of those allowed. They've allowed the most red zone passing attempts and the most downfield passing attempts, and that's what's been giving Adams a lot of his value. Right below them is Tet McMillan. Please score a touchdown. It has to happen eventually. They have allowed Dallas 5 wide receiver ones this season, and we're in week 6. So 5 games in, they've allowed 5 different wide receiver ones. They've allowed the most receiving touchdowns. They've allowed the most receiving fantasy points. It is set up for McMillan beautifully. There has been 3 wide receivers since 1991 when targets became a stat that have had 8 targets in every single game to start off their career through those first 5 games. McMillan has done that. It was Terry Glenn and Kelvin Benjamin, another Carolina receiver, not the greatest example. But the point is, he has put up insane volume to start the career that nobody sees. 5 straight games of 8 or more targets to start. I would expect the exact same thing against Dallas. Obviously, it's an incredible matchup. Hard to ever bench him. I've gotten some questions, and I get it, like him over Diggs is a really tough decision this week. But a lot of those where it's more fringe, like McMillan, he's basically in that must-start range this week because of the volume and the upside that he provides in this matchup. Xavier Worthy, really close to him. One more game without Rashee Rice. His volume has been amazing. I'm kind of surprised he's not projected even higher than this. Projected right around 15th for receivers this week. They're banged up in Detroit. That secondary, no Terrion Arnold. Brian Branch is questionable. It's going to be Rocky Sin on him for the majority of the time. For whatever you believe in PFF grades, I'm not a huge PFF grade person. However, Rocky Sin's grade is 50. So when it gets to be that bad, it's like, all right, well, he's probably not very good. So that matchup overall, pretty solid. And that was his grade last year for what it's worth. So Detroit, they are a 5-point bump for fantasy wide receivers. So it puts them in this green, a really nice matchup in general. Pittman Jr., going back to this matchup, him and Marvin Harrison Jr. opposite each other in this game. Arizona, they're a top 10 defense in terms of their pass defense, actually. They've only allowed 5 touchdowns. Top 10 in terms of those like yards per attempt, just general passing stats compared to just overall receivers. And if Jacoby Brissett does play, you would still want Kyler Murray in terms of the game script reasons. So if Jacoby Brissett does play, it makes me want to play Pittman a little less, but overall he's been really solid. So that's been encouraging if you got him. Odunze in this green as well, coming off the bye week. Washington is only better than Dallas and Miami in yards per attempt allowed this season. So they've been okay against wide receivers. They haven't been horrible, right around 21st, and they got some guys there. But in general, as a passing defense as a whole, it just hasn't been put together. So Daniels being back helps this game script. Odunze has moved all over the place. It's off the bye. The touchdown upside is obviously incredible. He's shown that. But I think it continues. It won't be as good as it's been through those 4 games. But those touchdown numbers are still going to be high. And the shot of it weekly is great. So that slot usage is actually key here because they got 2 corners that can play on the outside. Marshawn Lattimore still got it to an extent. Trey Amos been playing well, but Sainer still on the inside has been that weakness in the passing game at least. So Odunze, who's like a 40% slot guy, that could be where a lot of his production comes this week. Moving to the top left, this yellow here, I'm going to talk Pickens and Dak right now, basically, because this matchup is really interesting. I talked about Puka earlier, having 1 fantasy point per route against man so far this year, a ridiculous rate. Basically, the only stat that comes close to it is this one. George Pickens is averaging 0.9 fantasy points per route against cover 3. And Carolina runs one of the most in the NFL in terms of that defensive coverage. They run cover 3 a ton. It matches up for Pickens really well, and it makes sense. That is one of those coverages where you're one high safety. More of those big plays, those explosive plays downfield can happen. It's Pickens' strength. And the other stat is that they don't pressure the quarterback. And that is going to be a big part here because when Dak is under pressure, he usually keeps it short, even compared to the average NFL quarterback. But when he is not under pressure, compared to the average NFL quarterback still, he's chucking it downfield to George Pickens specifically. So Pickens is top 3 in terms of those targets downfield when Dak is not under pressure. We saw that last week. That's what paid off last week was Dak wasn't even being close to touched on his 40-yard touchdown. He was sitting back in the pocket all day. We could have some opportunities like that. J.C. Horn is going to be on about 50% of the time. He's not going to shadow, which is key. Helps Pickens a lot. But that is one of those where when Horn is on him, it's going to be really tough. He allows a 12% target share. The other plays, that's where those big plays can come in. So one of those true guys that has a very high ceiling this week, even though he's in this higher floor, lower ceiling section because of this matchup. And Deebo right next to him. One of those guys, he's at 8 targets every single game with Jayden Daniels this year, and that is with a couple games of having Terry McLaurin in there. So his worst game with Daniels is 17.4 fantasy points. And again, one of those, or two of those, came with Terry McLaurin in the game. So Chicago, they're still banged up in the secondary. They're still bottom 5 in yards per attempt allowed. So even though this matchup doesn't show that it's amazing, that's more of a fantasy thing for right now. In terms of a passing defense, the Bears haven't been like that good. So Daniels looks healthy. When we're looking at the Bears who they've played, as an example of that, like they played J.J. McCarthy, Geno, a Dallas team without CeeDee Lamb in terms of this receiver matchup, and then Detroit who smoked them. So still a good matchup for Deebo Samuel, I would say. I've done a lot of these graphs. I don't know if there's a single time that there has been such a linear line. A lot of the guys with really good volume or projected volume have great matchups, and the guys that you don't really get that good volume, they're not the runners, more of the pocket passers that aren't throwing it too much anyways. Well, they have bad matchups anyways. It's kind of nice. Speaking of that Chicago game, Washington with Daniels up here and Williams. Two great matchups overall. Jayden, I would start him confidently. The one worry last week was on top of Terry McLaurin being out, does he run? Jayden Daniels with that knee sprain. He did. The design rush rate, the scramble rate was basically the exact same, if not better, compared to last year. So he's going to run like he normally does. Great matchup overall. No, Terry McLaurin sucks, but you're still starting Jayden Daniels, I would say. And Caleb Williams, that volume has been amazing. Top 6 right now in the projection. We love that for a guy of his talent with that coaching because, like last year, not to always go back to Detroit and compare it with Ben Johnson, but like Jared Goff, his volume last year with Ben Johnson is where it is now, like bad, because he doesn't run and that passing volume was a little bit lower. But because Caleb both runs and his defense isn't very good, so they have to throw a little bit more, it helps his volume a ton. So that floor is a lot higher than Goff's last year, but that ceiling is still there. The matchup is there this week, off the bye, really like it. Bryce Young is one of those guys where, am I starting him in one quarterback leagues? Probably not, unless you have like a guy on bye, then I don't mind it at all. But especially in 2 quarterback leagues, like it's hard not to start him. Just one stat, like it's the Dallas defense. Obviously, you can see that they're 32nd, but they have had 5 matchups. They have allowed a top 5 quarterback or top 8 quarterback every single game. 5 for 5 in top 8 quarterbacks allowed week in, week out. A guy is top 8. So not even a quarterback 1, but top 8. So Bryce Young, it's a hard guy to sit, even though he hasn't been playing too well. Jordan Love is down here. Similar for Cincinnati. Any quarterback that's worth anything. We got Nix, Goff, and Lawrence. So guys in fantasy that haven't really been good, but like they're not horrible. Cincinnati, they've allowed 20 plus fantasy points to them. So Jordan Love, lower floor. Part of that is because of that game script. We'll see what Joe Flacco can do against this Packers defense. But the last time Joe Flacco, you didn't play well against the Packers, but he at least got the win. So Jordan Love's game script is there. Wouldn't expect that this time, but Jordan Love just depends on if he can get those touchdowns before it's a blowout. Same exact thing with Goff, but Goff, it worked for him, had over 20 points. Going up back to this green with Patrick Mahomes, he's just been incredible. And the two things with this is just that volume. The last couple of years, his volume is probably not even in this top 15, honestly. So much of the time, it's not even just that his passing attempts have been a little lower, but he was always short and he wasn't running as much. Now he leads the NFL in scrambles this season and he's number 1 in air yards. So in terms of his upside that he's bringing, like those two are like 2 of the main stats that we look for in terms of like a weekly upside player, and Mahomes is number 1 in both. So he's running a ton. A lot of that is because maybe lack of weapons, specifically a lack of Rashee Rice. So Rice will obviously help in areas, but in terms of the scrambling, Mahomes is rushing more because of it. And the air yards downfield, he's just chucking it. He's chucking it. It's awesome. It's so different compared to the last 2 years. Matt Nagy has finally allowed him to throw downfield. Who knew that he could? Justin Herbert also in this green. An interesting one because Miami's defense, another one where especially against like receivers we saw in this last graph, it looks like they're good. Quarterbacks, they're not horrible at least. But in terms of the yards per attempt, like they're still bottom 3. Like they're not a good passing defense. They do the pressure the quarterback a decent amount, which isn't good for Justin Herbert, who leads the NFL in pressures right now. And the bad thing for Herbert in terms of fantasy is sadly, this year at least, When he has been under pressure, he doesn't scramble, which is really important for fantasy. He just throws it. So it's a lot of those short routes, those short targets, compared to more fantasy scrambles and the upside there. So it's a very low 7% scramble rate when he is under pressure. And Miami right now, they're last against rushing quarterbacks. So the hope is that Justin Herbert, with maybe no running back help, starts to run it a little bit more, maybe scrambles under pressure a little bit more here. That is where the upside can come in. And it's what makes this matchup good, is because they are last against quarterbacks on the ground. But we'll see if that happens. It's not a confident start, but I don't mind him still. And then Daniel Jones down here again in this yellow. The rushing recently has been the problem. And I think a lot of times I might make like a full video on this, because a lot of times through these first 3 weeks of the fantasy season, like narratives are born and then it's kind of like thought that way for the rest of the year. One of those was, oh, Daniel Jones is rushing a ton. He's got those red zone carries. He had the quarterback sneaks for touchdown, all that sort of stuff. He's a dual threat quarterback again. Amazing for fantasy. And it can come back. We'll see how it is this week before it really cements things. But right now, his carries by game was 7, 6, 4, 1, 1. So he hasn't really been rushing after those first 2 weeks, at least the first 3 weeks. They are last in red zone passing rate right now. So the touchdowns are a little lower. He's playing great, but without that rushing, he's not nearly as good in fantasy. Ending with running backs here, another Panther, of course. 32nd ranked defense in Dallas. It honestly isn't as bad as the wide receiver and quarterback. For running backs right now, a large reason of why they are 32nd is because Josh Jacobs in week 4, but also receiving. So it's not as good for Dowdle. They're like 23rd against rushing fantasy points in terms of running backs right now. They are last in success rate, so still a really good matchup. But Dowdle, even as a starter, had a really low route share. Had a couple screens, which is good. 4 targets still. But even with that low route share, number 4 volume on the week. So we know he had that great production, but still top 5 running back volume, and it's a revenge game. How are you not starting him after last week? I could see a world where it doesn't work out, especially in this offense, but it's a good offensive line, great matchup in general, scoring opportunity. You still start him and hope for the best. JCM down here in the bottom right. The number 1 offensive line advantage on the week, and it's not close. So Chicago will be a little bit better. They will be, because on offense and on defense, they're getting players back. They just had the bye week. TJ Edmonds was a full practice on Thursday, so at least he'll be back at the linebacker position. But still a good matchup overall. Like, JCM is number 1 in yards before contact. I talked about Jayden rushing again, so that'll be available in terms of giving him space in that read option game. That offensive line is pretty solid overall. And the Bears are just, dead last in yards before contact. That's why they're the number 1 offensive line advantage this week. So that rushing production, it's a lower floor still because he doesn't get the receiving. It's not a ton of rushing volume, but the efficiency, the production, we saw that ceiling play out last week. So even though it's a lower floor, still got that high ceiling. Chicago is 31st in yards after contact per attempt. The team that's 32nd is Tennessee. Ashton Jeanty's matchup this week after going off against Chicago earlier this year. Obviously, we've all seen the yards after contact stats for Jeanty. He's been incredible, and that is where his production has had to come. And the other positive is they're the favorites. Who knows if that's going to happen for the rest of the year for the Raiders, but they are 4.5-point favorites. The Titans, they've allowed double-digit rushing touchdowns already. We are 5 games in. So it sets up Jeanty for that ceiling potential again when he has a very flawed situation. Kolton Miller is now out there left tackle. That does not help. It's one of their only bright spots on that offensive line. So makes it even worse for Jeanty overall in terms of the situation that he's been given. But matchup's perfect. With no tight ends in there, we saw him get a little bit more targets. So that first big target game, I don't think that's a coincidence in terms of Mayer and Bowers both being out. Lots of the times that running back tight end targets are correlated. Rachaad White over here next to him, he had the number 8 volume last week. So similar to Dowdle, he comes in, gets top 10 running back volume right away. So that projected volume this week, makes sense to me. He got a ton of that rushing volume in terms of compared to Sean Tucker. So Tucker got basically nothing. Rachaad White, great receiving back as well. Tough not to start him. Any guy that gets top 10 volume, and the matchup is in the green here. Quinshon Judkins in the yellow. His name is in the green, but his dot is in the yellow. Down here, honestly, Pittsburgh closer to that top 10 rushing defense. And that's what we're looking at here for Judkins. He doesn't get too much receiving. That's been a little bit of an issue. Hopefully it isn't an issue long term. Like 3 targets for Judkins is fine, but his routes shot down last week. They went back to Jerome Ford in the passing game. Judkins really didn't get much of anything in the passing game last week. So that's the worry. Like Pittsburgh offense, I think they can keep it close in terms of this Browns defense is so good, but they're still 5.5-point favorites. Good rushing defense in general. So it's more of that higher floor or lower floor because of that passing game, but higher ceiling just because of Judkins' efficiency overall. Bijan up in this top left, he has been incredible in receiving. His rushing production in terms of his yards and touchdowns isn't anything that's earth-shattering, and I think that's where it's going to have to come in this game. Buffalo, they're not good on the ground. They have been one of the best against receiving running backs this year, though. So Bijan, a guy who's obviously been incredible in terms of his efficiency, but that volume is a little bit lower. The goal line attempts haven't been fully there. Can he get some of those big chunk plays on the ground again against this Buffalo team to really pay off? He does have the number 2 advantage on the week in the offensive line, defensive line matchup, so he's set up well there at least. Achane next to him, a weird one because he plays like 5 different positions. So going through it, the matchup, the Chargers, good defense. 7th against the run in terms of running back rushing fantasy points allowed. In terms of the slot, they are 13th, and they are 9th best overall in terms of receiving running backs. So, better than average in basically everything. Good defense overall. Obviously, Achane is still a start. He has not been consistent in the way that he does it, but in terms of his consistency, he hasn't had a game under 16 fantasy points this year. So overall, pretty amazing in general there. Michael Carter down here in the red, 23 touches last week. It still doesn't make me trust him. For a lot of these guys, it is just a lot of risky plays when you get to these Woody Marks, Michael Carters, even JCM, Henderson, these guys that haven't been proven week to week yet. They can get the volume, but it's a little less predictable in this volume. And when we're getting maybe Brissett in there, the Colts defense, they're not playing a Tennessee Titans defense that's allowed 100 rushing yards every single game. Going back to that Jeanty matchup, 100 yards in every single game for the Titans defense. So it's not that perfect matchup anymore. Does he get 23 touches? He wasn't really good in terms of his per touch success. So if he gets 15 against this Colts defense, is it really going to be that great? I don't have super high hopes still. Pittsburgh running backs over here got Warren. Gainwell is okay for the fluke reasons, but this defense in general has been amazing. Gibbs did well against them. It's hard to stop Gibbs. But they shut down David Montgomery, Henry, Jacobs, Jordan Mason. This is one of the best run defenses in the NFL. They're the best in yards before contact. They stuff you at the line of scrimmage. So Jaylen Warren, these Steelers running backs, they're going to be fluky. They're going to have a lot of floor games and a lot of ceiling games. This is one where I would lean toward the odds of it being more of a floor game just because of the matchup. They're fine in the flex because they're so fluky, but it's not one that I'm loving. And then at the bottom left here, I get questions about it a ton, and I get it. Derrick Henry, it hasn't been good. It's hard to play on volume alone, really. He has had 15 or fewer touches 4 straight games. He did that 4 times all of last year. So the volume just isn't there. The matchup isn't great. This defense is horrible. They're 32nd in scoring, which screws with his game script and his touches. The offensive line isn't as good. The efficiency drops a lot with no Lamar Jackson. So all that being said, it's really tough to start him right now, week to week. Next week, they had the bye. Lamar will probably come back after that. I would have hope after that. I don't think he's falling off a cliff here in terms of his numbers and efficiency. I don't really think he's the problem. So it's tough because his numbers aren't good. But I don't think this is Henry's old now thing. In terms of long term, decently confident in a solid bounce back here once Lamar is back. He'll help that offensive line who's more middle of the road this year compared to elite. Hopefully that scoring defense goes from 32nd to 25th, 20th. Gives them in better second half situations. That volume bumps back up. They get their identity back a little bit, and Henry starts paying off big for you down the road. This week, though, probably not too confident. But that's my 3 graphs. Hope you guys enjoyed. I'll try to answer any comments by Sunday morning. Get around to them eventually. I'll see you guys soon.